What's the worst HR is not your friend story you've witnessed/experienced? Story 1. I asked my boss for a desk phone with a hands-free feature because sometimes I needed it for conference calls with people at work. I had an old yellow phone. He sent a request and told me to contact the office manager. I sent him a nice letter explaining what I was asking for and why I needed it for HR. My office manager responded to everything and told HR, per Lazarus 870's request, do I need to order the phone through the same channel I used before, or is there a new policy? Asking me. HR replied indignantly. She asked why I needed the phone. It was mentioned in the email, demanded an answer, and then accused my office manager of ordering the phone without approval behind HR's back. When the office manager told her supervisor about this, my supervisor called HR and reprimanded her, and I heard her yelling in my ear. The supervisor came out of his office and yelled at me, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. He was furious, but I know he didn't mean to hurt me. I just laughed at him. HR had to apologize to the office manager for the accusations. Eventually, after an hour of yelling at me, it turned out that the speakerphone I needed was literally free, and there were several boxes of it in stock. I had it for a month until HR installed a new high-end phone that was actually expensive and difficult to set up and use. I needed training. At company picnics, we had to wear name tags, which was a surprise. I had never met a female HR employee before, but she came up to me and said, oh my God, we haven't met. What's your name? Story 2. When I was only 19 years old, I worked at Fred Meyer's Bakery for about 6 months. There was a creepy guy about 45 years old working in the meat and seafood department, and all the women in my department, and even those who used to work in my department but were transferred to other departments to get away from him, warned me about him from day one. For some reason, whenever I had a break, he would find himself on break himself, following me into the break room and trying to flirt with me the whole time. He followed me not only on breaks and during lunch, but if I needed to walk to another part of the store to buy something, he would run, catch up to me, and walk with me. Several times he followed me to my car after my shift was over, and worst of all, when I was working alone in the closing area, he walked into the back of the bakery. The scariest was when I was working alone in the closing area and he came in and followed me all around the long table trying to grab me and telling me how much he loved me and how much he wanted to be with me. I kept saying, no, leave me alone, but the managers just shrugged and said, that's just the way he is. One day my boyfriend threatened him when he finished work. He said he would go back to the store, and 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 he would go back to the store. One night when I was about to close up alone, he came into the back room, the freezer room, tried to kiss me and grabbed my asterisk. I pushed him away and ran to the manager in charge of closing the store, who also works in HR. He said he would look at the store records and talk to me the next day. The next day, he pulled me into his office and told me that he had watched the videotape and had seen this man harassing me in and out of the workplace. When I replied that this had been going on for months and that I couldn't take it anymore, he said, he just does it with all the new girls. Once the other girls are hired, he'll leave me alone. I told him he was an idiot and quit on the spot. I eventually found out that this P***ERT was the brother of the store owner, who had been in prison in the past for sexual assault and rape and was now unraveling his life. Note, a 45-year-old man stalked me, a 19-year-old, for 6 months. I repeatedly told my manager about it, but he wouldn't listen. He told me it was a misunderstanding. The manager said he just does this to all new girls, and when a new girl is hired, he'll stalk her, not me. The man turned out to be a registered sex offender for sexual assault and rape, but he was spared because he was the manager's brother. Story 3. A coworker accidentally rear-ended my parked personal vehicle with his company truck. He immediately reported it to me and the local manager. We took pictures and filled out an accident report. Everyone in our office agreed with what happened, that it was an honest accident and that the cost of repairing my car should be covered by the company's insurance. This is where the human resources manager stepped in. At first, he wanted to hold me responsible because it was my personal vehicle that caused the accident. My car was parked in the parking lot, and I was at my desk at the time of the accident. When I pointed this out, he backed off and said he would file a lawsuit. I then got a call from a hostile insurer from the insurance company demanding my insurance information, or he would go to court. It turned out that the claim was filed by a human resources manager, saying that a coworker had witnessed me driving into a parked work truck and trying to flee the scene, and had reported me. I told the adjuster what really happened and emailed him a photo and signed accident report and witness statements. The next day, I received a settlement agreement from HR requiring me to sign a document releasing the company from any further liability and receive $1,100 for repairs. I had just taken my car to the repair shop and had not yet received an estimate. I declined and was told I could either accept their offer or consider myself out of luck. At this point, I contacted my insurance company and told them what had happened. Throughout the story, I could hear the agent almost cheering at the blatantly illegal tactics HR had used on me. In the end, they processed my claim and filed a subrogation claim against my insurance company. He also said he would probably seek additional damages due to falsified statements in the original claim. Don't mess with USAA. They are a very good company. The repair ended up costing over $4,000 and I didn't have to pay a dime, including the deductible. I don't know if the HR director faced a similar outcome, but the VP of Finance's year-end report included a comment that additional costs need to be reduced due to delays and inaccuracies in reporting compensation claims. Story 4. The company I work for does an anonymous survey every year. The first 2 years, I worked in a terrible department under a terrible manager. The questionnaires were anonymous, but they were separated by manager, which was fine, but my manager had 3 subordinates and I could easily tell who was who. At a department meeting, the assistant director said, "If anyone has a complaint and wants to say something, now is the time." There were 30 people in the room and most of them were looking at me. I was very uncomfortable. My manager made me write down everything I did on an Excel sheet and review it during our weekly one-on-one meetings, telling me that 20 minutes of your day was not recorded. I may have taken a porridge or had a conversation with someone. He spoke very little English and wanted me to help him or fix something. It's weird. That's not my job. Luckily, he was removed as manager. The department was split up. And now I'm in a new job making twice the salary under a wonderful and understanding manager. I recently had a COVID and went to work. If I had been sick for 5 days, my manager would have had to file for short-term disability, so I signed up for a 6th day so that wouldn't happen, and when I told my manager that I was signing up so that wouldn't happen, he got angry and told me not to worry about it and that he wouldn't report it. If he had resigned, I would have pursued him. Story 5. One of the coworkers is known as a big weirdo. She hides it by attending social committee meetings. She recently moved to a different department to get a promotion. Her manager hid her crapey job for fear that someone else on the same committee as her was dealing with legal issues, or was blaming it on us. When her manager tried to transfer her again, her former department head who worked in the legal department berated her and wouldn't take it. So her manager left for another job. The new manager was also promoted from another department, and apparently his department has significantly reduced company costs by eliminating unnecessary things. He doesn't care about regular work hours. He can set his own schedule as long as things are going well, and if they aren't, he needs an explanation as to why they aren't going well to help fix them. Rumor has it that he's autistic or something, because he doesn't really move, and if people tell him something, he believes it. But she just didn't do a good job. The work was terrible and full of mistakes. Then he asked her what was wrong. She replied that there was too much work and not enough time in the day. So he suspended her from 3 social committees, hired a temporary employee for 4 weeks, trained 2 people, and trained her too. However, the unusual woman complained to HR. HR then went to file a complaint against him for polluting the work environment. He showed her an email saying that she was mostly dealing with social commitments for 5 hours a week and that she was falling behind in her work. So he hired a temp and trained them all, and this temp, who was less educated than he was and also a weirdo, worked better than his staff. He then asked her to increase her budget so he could hire part-time workers if he really needed to. Now the HR department avoids her calls. They like her, and they don't want to tell her she's a weirdo. But they know full well that this weird guy does weird paperwork, that she can't do her job, and that less experienced people do it better than she does. They just want to get rid of it. But the strange woman doesn't do that. She starts talking to the VP of HR and the previous department manager during coffee breaks about how nervous she is, that she has no training, etc. These two managers know she's had training, and they're sick of her complaining all the time. So HR turned the tables on her. They made her write a benefits brochure that talked about the helpline and psychiatry. After that, they stopped seeing her. She tried to get a job in her old department, but was not accepted there. She told everyone about her situation and how unfair it was. That's when she panicked. An anonymous survey of employees was conducted. Everyone in her department said they were quite happy, except for her. She thought it would be clever to say the manager at her department was racist to discredit her boss. But he's multiracial. The other two managers on her team are all LP, but her VP is whiter than Pan, so she decided the accusations of racism applied to her. And everyone in the department knew which one of them was unhappy. On top of that, she made HR and the VP fear for her bonuses because they were tied to employee performance. Then the situation worsened. She was evicted from the building. She didn't want to do her job, thought HR was her friends, and when that turned out not to be the case, claimed she was racially discriminated against. It was insane. Story 6. Service Inquiry. It was a fair and honest criticism of a system that was not working as intended. I had little exposure to the system, but it was all reasonable. In fact, I was demoted because of this issue. A position was created above me and my peer became my supervisor. No such position previously existed. This happened the same week that my husband died, and my manager felt bad about it. However, after I returned to work, I was essentially condemned at a company-wide meeting for criticizing the same system and explained what System XX should be, that it does work and that anyone who thinks it doesn't work is an idiot. 2 years later, the person in the position above me quit, partly because of the treatment of me and partly because he was afraid to tell the company that something had gone wrong, and the position had to be promoted because it had to exist by the rules, and I was the only one who could do it. I laughed when at the next company-wide meeting it was recognized that System X was not working and they were discussing it to find out why. I laughed. I had to leave the room before I became hysterical. Edit. Typo. Story 7. In the middle of my shift, I was pulled out for a meeting with 2 HR managers. I was ushered into a very nice conference room, which was confusing because I was just a low-level employee, and here was literally a floor above where I was supposed to be. They sat me down and asked me if I had anything to tell them about myself. I replied that I had no idea what they were talking about because I was still confused. They were all very quiet and serious, and I got scared. And they said, "You know what you did. Here's the reason you were fired, etc." I was only a few minutes late, and I thought it was too much. I insist I don't understand what's going on. One of them noticed something was wrong, opened the folder, and said, "You're Mr. XX, aren't you?" It turned out that I had been confused with someone else with the same name. I was still sweating when I got off the elevator alone. I don't know what that other person did, but HR is not a game. Story 8. I used to work for a small IT contractor for the mod. She used to tell people off for simply not turning up 15 minutes early or hugging a colleague on their last day of work. She would hide behind cubicle walls and peek in on people's conversations. Under her leadership, probably 20 to 30 people were fired just because they didn't like her, and just as many quit. These were wonderfully talented people who were experts at what they did. After years of complaining, HR finally responded and sent an independent consultant to interview our team. We finally had something working for us. Soon our suffering would be over, we thought. But we were all fooled. We all met with the consultant to discuss our problems with the toxic manager, and the consultant wrote it all down in a notebook. I was never targeted by the toxic manager, but my notes took up a whole page. A few weeks later, a meeting was called. It was attended by the HR manager, a supervisor, and an independent consultant. The HR manager stood up and said, "Team, we have reviewed your comments and complaints about the toxic manager. You need to grow up. You are not high school students." Story 9. When one department was closed at noon due to air conditioning problems, the manager had to move cubicles and remove part of the drop ceiling. The manager invited everyone to the bar for a team-building exercise. When everyone in the department came to work the next morning, they found on their desks an ultimatum in lieu of termination for drinking on the job and stealing time. A third employee was fired for misuse of a company credit card. The manager's supervisor, the vice president, called HR and asked to pick up the rookie's termination form even though he had already submitted it. Instead, HR sent an entirely new policy manual and told the vice president to sign and return all termination forms the same day. The VP reported this to his boss, the CEO, who not only didn't see it, but didn't even approve it, and HR didn't back down when the CEO called him. Indeed, the CEO did not approve it, but asked to consider revising it back in March. It was a great reorganization. They went back to square one and completely rewrote it, full of best practices, standard rules, and clear language. And it's been in effect since May, so maybe he'd better sign it. Oh no. The CEO had no sooner finished reading the first page than he discovered contract law violations. Page 3 found violations of federal labor law. Page 4 drew the ire of the NLRB, and 6 lawsuits were filed against sections of the PTO. The human resources manager was asked to resign. When she refused, she was fired. Story 10. I went to HR to report that my team leader was illegally underpaying everyone. HR's response was to adopt a new company-wide policy to address the payroll issue and pay most people a certain amount, further making me look like a dodger. HR and IT disabled some of my login accounts to the tools we used, and a few months later fired me when they couldn't fix the problem, and I was actually able to work. They then tried to deny my application for unemployment benefits. I told the unemployment officer that I had logs showing that I had done something to break a tool that I didn't even have access to. They also didn't think to disable my email access in a timely manner, so I was able to back up all of my emails with IT department documents confirming exactly what happened. The unemployment insurance company approved my claim and gave them a hefty fine. Story 11. The warehouse where I worked regularly hid shipments of dangerous goods to save money. This went on for years. Over time, I rose through the ranks and eventually became the warehouse manager. I absolutely refused to ship anything until I started properly declaring shipments of hazardous materials. What was the solution? My supervisor began signing the manifests on my behalf. This went on for several weeks until the employees realized they had to do it. Obviously, they knew how much trouble the boss could get into. So the next time he needed to ship a shipment, he had a new employee in the warehouse sign for him. They said they were training him on how to do the paperwork, but the poor guy didn't know anything about it. So he refused and left. I was later told that my actions were damaging to the image of the company and should be stopped. I told HR exactly what was going on and that I would have no part in it. Less than a week later, I was removed from my job and fired due to company restructuring. This is the most dishonest **T I've ever seen. My rough estimate of the money they saved was about $250,000 a year. They're disgusting. The whole family. Story 12. I generally get along well with HR, with one exception. When I was in university, I was working in the help desk of a company when the head of HR came to me for help. He had created an Excel spreadsheet and couldn't figure out how to make the formulas what he wanted them to look like. I was in the same building and offered to go and look at it, but he refused because the spreadsheet contained confidential information. I then asked if he could explain what he was trying to do without divulging any specific information, and he said that what he was trying to do was confidential information. Then I made it clear that he wanted me to tell him how to do something, but I couldn't see it, and he couldn't even tell me exactly what he was trying to do. Then he agreed that I couldn't help him until he could tell me anything. As soon as he hung up, he called my supervisor and complained that I was useless. Story 13. Not as bad as yours, but it still ticked me off. I'm from the IT department and regularly work long hours with no days off. I've been here for over 10 years and basically rebuilt their operation from the ground up. There was a server incident and I worked 12 hours from Sunday evening to Monday morning. Monday was a staff meeting that lasted 3 hours in a hot room, and I fell asleep while the legal director went on a particularly tedious tirade about how overworked they were. Because of this, I was called into HR. They had the nerve to lecture me about my commitment to my job and warn me that anyone who falls asleep on the job will be fired. Yes, they fire nurses who sleep unsupervised with patients on the night shift, not employees who doze off during meetings. This is especially true after a 90-hour work week and after a couple hours of sleep. The only reason they made a fuss, apparently, was because a legal officer complained to my friend the CEO for not bringing it to my attention with an update on an important employee. That was 2 years ago, and I still can't get it out of my head. Every time I get a call from a recruiter and I want to dodge the call, I remember that incident. Story 14. At my last real job before I went independent, I had an exit interview with a woman in HR. She was actually a friend of the CEO and was only filling in because the real HR woman, who had a degree in HR and everything, had quit. A lot of people left that company. It was a terrible place to work where the management team was impatient to the extreme, full of megalomania and stalling, building a website for a niche business that was mostly made up of old people who thought the internet was magic. During my interview, she asked why I was leaving. I replied that I really liked my coworkers, but I hated the company. She looked annoyed, very frustrated, and said that other people who had recently interviewed had told her the same thing. It took my breath away to hear the same thing over and over again from so many people who had spent their time moving to a better place and never considered that something needed to change. Story 15. The human resources and payroll manager at the small hospital where I worked had a bad habit of not paying bonuses to new employees, which were paid in 3 small installments throughout the year or when I worked extra shifts. After repeated requests to compensate for the delay, I contacted the company and they quickly resolved my problem. A few weeks later, I was fired for forgetting my badge on one of my shifts, and because my assistant was late and sitting with a patient, I received less favorable evaluations than if I had volunteered for that shift. When I was called to pick up my termination letter, the director of nursing was shocked, but in the end there was little she could do. Story 16. I worked in HR for a while, and I have a worse opinion of it than all the stories I've heard. One story in particular left a lasting impression. A young, erratic female employee complained of sexual harassment by her supervisor. I ritually informed upper management about it, but they didn't care whether the supervisor did anything about it or not. This was just one case I dealt with, but it was a daily occurrence. Literally phone calls and emails from people who were deemed unable to opt out were getting pop-up notifications. Part-time job. I've been doing my job properly, but I haven't been paid in 2 months and I can't pay my rent? Oops, tough luck. Can't be helped. How about the boss who forgot to fill out the timesheet? Sure, a quick payment and we'll put it in your account by the end of the day. HR is there to protect the business. Want us to protect you? Join a union. Story 17. I was harassed by a human resources manager who caught me using all the expressions from the anti-harassment training he had organized. At the time, my employer was deciding whether to keep me on the job or fire me, and I was very tense. I had to confront him about it, and he kept coming up with a bunch of excuses and kept holding me back. Haha, this is what you want, right? You have my consent, right? I have to get your consent. Ha, ha, ha. If the hiring manager is doing this, who are you talking to? They had already fired me and he knew about it but didn't tell me. A week or so later, I had another meeting with the department head where he simply said, "We're not extending you," and threw a large envelope with my unemployment benefits across the table. Story 18. A long-standing grudge in late December 99 as an HBUX system administrator, and because I worked closest to it, I was asked to come into the office after midnight to run some tests. I didn't mind as I didn't drink alcohol and didn't celebrate New Year's Eve too much at all. If there were no problems, it took an hour and a half, and after a few pager calls, I was off home. An hour tops, including the drive. If things weren't going well, I would call whoever I could and pass the problem on to someone else. So my CTO offered me a minimum of 6 hours of overtime for this inconvenience at 2.5 times pay. We had heard of people being paid £2.5 for working millennials, and it seemed like a good deal. All went well, and by 1:30 a.m. I was home. In their opinion, as I had a duty pager that week, I was entitled to the normal, very small, pager rate and the rate for hours worked. A few months went by, and according to my supervisor, the CTO had to calmly talk to the HR manager and ask her exactly what she was doing during the New Year's Eve celebration, but I got my money's worth. There were no problems after that, so HR decided it wasn't worth the money and challenged that they would only pay the regular labor rate. Story 19. HR hired a consultant and organized a discussion to boost employee morale. In essence, he said, "We're not employees of the company. Tell us everything you don't like about working here, everything you'd like to change, and we'll compile it all into a report for management. Don't worry, it's anonymous. We just need material for the report, and you guys can give us your opinion on improvements to the company." In the end, HR and the consultant recorded all the sessions and reproduced the highlights for management. Employees were disciplined for simply criticizing the company or their immediate supervisors, and any semblance of trust in management was instantly destroyed. Managers now complain that they don't know what's going on in their teams because no one tells them anything. Why is this happening? Story 20. I used to work in human resources, and here is my advice. Never volunteer information when answering a phishing question. Answer briefly and concisely, and don't elaborate unless absolutely necessary. Don't pass on information you overhear unless it relates directly to you or your work environment. My goal is to protect my interests under the guise of employee relations. If you are causing headaches and interfering with work, we will find a way to terminate your employment whether you are right or wrong. I have spent hours in training to learn how to ask the right questions to get the results the company wants. This may not apply to all HR departments, but in large companies we are not on your side, and our attitude and feigned concern can be used as a disarming tactic to get the information you need. No matter what they say, we have a purpose. Story 21. I was diagnosed with severe depression, and it was affecting my work. My supervisor was sympathetic and tried to help me in any way she could. She offered paid time off while I sorted out my dosages so I could focus on my mental health and get back to a more normal lifestyle, and advised me to talk to HR to start doing so. HR took it favorably and gave me all the information, but fired me a week or two later. This was a month before the pandemic started, and I'm still unemployed. Yes, I know this is illegal. However, after consulting with a lawyer, I'm convinced that there isn't enough written evidence on both sides, so HR can claim they didn't know and I can't prove it was wrong enough to matter. Also, technically they didn't fire me. Instead, if they had agreed not to sue me, they would have paid me a large severance package. According to the new schedule, I had to complete 100% of my work for the next year or more within 2 months, or they would fire me without severance. The best part was that by the time I decided to talk to HR about sick leave, it had been months since my boss suggested it, and the doctor had already adjusted the dosage several times. I was overwhelmed because I loved my job and tried to deal with it, but eventually the bottom fell out. I felt like I was digging myself a hole. But the day I was laid off was the most productive day I've had in years. I was finally on the right medication and felt really good. But of course, I got a severance package. This company is crazy. Story 22. A month after I was promoted from employee to manager, one of my coworkers decided to hit on me. I am a man. She is a woman, a few years younger than me. Despite the fact that I am her supervisor, she decided not to take no for an answer. At first, she insisted that I was clearly interested in her and the difficulties were only due to my working conditions, and ignored the fact that I had a girlfriend at the time. Then came the HR review, and she's doing pretty well, but there are a few things she needs to improve on compared to the rest of the team. I'm committed to helping her become a top performer by the end of the year. GR missing. Her. Buit. She changes the subject and decides I'm punishing her because I can't be with her. She starts refusing coaching and constructive criticism, berates me in front of colleagues and clients, and insists that I have to get over myself and date her like we both want to. I continue to refuse her advances even though HR has stepped in. Everything has been documented and many people have been supportive. They have warned me to befriend her. Since she is a spoiled rich kid whose father is an insurance lawyer, HR decided that the company couldn't waste time and money on the legal problems that would arise if she was fired. Eventually, she said she didn't want to be with me anymore and that I was a horrible boss who just hated her because she wouldn't go out with me. Her attitude got even worse, and I assigned another manager to literally tell her what to do. She loses her temper no matter what I say, whether it's that I'm unemotional, too emotional, not clear, too clear and harsh in my communication, or whatever. If someone else had taken my advice and repeated what I said, she wouldn't have argued. A year and a half later, I was promoted again, spoiler. I wasn't a terrible manager after all, and thankfully moved to a new team. I resent HR for putting up with that little ST for so long. Because if I had officially disciplined him, let alone fired him, the harassment could have carried over to the company. HR will always put the company before you. Story 23. My ex's mother worked in human resources. She was a pretty STID person and loved nothing more than coming home, gossiping, and giving us drama. This woman could not keep quiet. It was funny at the time, but looking back, I realized it was horrible. I reported my supervisor for a sexist attitude to HR. HR said they would talk to me again before I went to my boss. 2 days later, he fired me. He was friends with all the upper management, so I wasn't surprised. They took me out before I could gather the necessary evidence in my computer. Yes, I was young and STID and hadn't learned how to back up. Story 24. A colleague told me about an anomalous phenomenon that other colleagues were engaged in. They would disappear for hours at a time, sleeping in their cars. Their jobs could easily be described as busy, and they were constantly on the move. They would show up to work late and, despite being late, call HR to say they forgot to show up. I have witnessed this. One day he says he went to school X, and the next day he says he went to school X. And then one day, having several witnesses, she called them. Then they, knowing that my colleagues were JS, said, Hitler was right. They went up the chain of events, but none of them wanted to back them up. While they were investigating, my co-workers' friends were fortunately put on paid vacation. Everyone at work started treating them badly. They tried to get a record, but it was too late. Their lawyer said that a case could be brought, but it would be a nightmare to prove and would end up costing too much in the long run. They got in a lot of other trouble and eventually had to quit because of HR reports and the fact that their co-workers were as less. Story 25. I worked as IT support for a small PI and MM law firm of about 25 people. For the past 3 years, I was one of the most beloved employees. I was always the person who strived to do the best and impossible, and I wasn't perfect. But I showed up on time, did my job consistently, didn't complain, and got along well with everyone. However, I had a bad habit of becoming an employee representative when it came to certain issues, such as the lack of a health care plan or a sexual harassment incident between a manager and an intern. She quit because of poor management response. I started as a file clerk and then was assigned to the IT department. I loved my job. Sure, the pay wasn't great, but it was stable and I was constantly learning new things. I was an official employee and the head of IT was an independent contractor who came into the office once or twice a month to check on my work. The Friday before the lockout started, I called the manager and asked if she had a plan for me to work from home if a lockout was called. She didn't have such a plan, so I called the general counsel and asked him. He came to my small office and said that my behavior was frightening and irrational and that there would be no lockout. First voice. He was a workaholic, so being out of the office was a nightmare for him. So I just shrugged and left it at that. Then a colleague offered a list of COVID protocols that could only be minimally accomplished and asked me to go over it with a few people and sign it before presenting it. I did so, as did the secretary and a few other people. After getting the signatures, she went to the office and presented it to her supervisor. The meeting with the general counsel and office manager was horrible. I was told it turned into a rather heated exchange, and she mentioned my name as one of the people who had reviewed and recommended the case. Strike 2. I was called into the office to be reprimanded. My boss seriously dismissed the possibility of a lockout, deemed the protocol list Firmon ***ing, threatened to fire me for signing it, and said I was lucky to be working. Literally an hour before the exit, the mayor announced a lockdown. Suddenly, the entire management and HR team started trying to come up with a lockout plan. My boss called us all into a conference room, offered us each a beer. I'm a recovering addict, so I refrained from casual drinking and smoking. I don't drink, I smoke, and told us we'd all have to go to work. Pandemic shandemic. He didn't know what to do. The head of IT called and put together a plan of action based on what the rest of his company was doing. We discussed tasks that I could do for the foreseeable future. So for the first 2 days I sat at home and did pretty much what I could. Then at 10 a.m. on Wednesday morning, I got the call. The pandemic would only last a few weeks, and I was an indispensable employee. I had my own reasons for not wanting to go to work, the hour-long subway ride, and the living conditions. I had to think beyond myself, and at the salary I was making at the time, I didn't have health insurance, and it didn't seem worth it. After I made it clear that it was out of the question, I told them that I understood their situation and would do whatever was necessary. They didn't expect this reaction, as I had relied on them for a lot of things up to that point, and it made them very angry. So in the middle of discussing my severance package, they started talking about me as being lazy and ungrateful. Sure, it's illegal, but the reason for the termination was this employee is difficult to work with. They probably thought that by the time my vacation expired, the world would be back to normal. They would be back in the office, and I would be begging them. Little did they know. During the pandemic, I started freelancing as a video editor, and now I have a stable enough job to make a living. I'm much happier now than I was then. In August, this company started calling my cell phone again, but I blocked their number. I ignored many of these calls because I valued my stable job above all else. Truth be told, I had no intention of quitting. Story 26. The head of department, the team leader, and the HR lady were in charge and made everyone miserable. We were called in on every occasion, lectured, and listened to our conversations during breaks. When I was sitting at home with a high fever due to the flu, the phone rang, and it was the team leader. I didn't bother to answer the phone. She then sent me several emails and called me because she couldn't find the document on the server. Tired of this situation, I had to pick up the phone and explain to her in general terms how to work and explore. I was furious. I went back to work, went to HR, and asked if it was okay to be harassed or receive emails to my personal number when I was sick. The HR employee said she would talk to her supervisor. She must have lied a lot in this interview. The HR person insinuated that I talk badly about my boss because I have mental health issues and that I do bad things to other people because I hate myself or some other such nonsense. I started crying in anger and headed for the door to leave this bizarre session. The HR person got in my face and said, "How dare you leave?" I screamed, "This isn't over. This isn't over. If you walk out that door, you are finished here." Close the door. I panicked and stayed in the office, terrified of her. I was lectured for another 20 minutes under the pretext of mental health issues. After this episode, I called the Health and Safety Agency and other organizations and told them what had happened over the phone. They were shocked. I left the company immediately and left things as they were. Another former coworker experienced the same thing and contacted the Department of Labor to tell them what had happened. A few years later, we found out by chance that we were being investigated for mobbing because so many people had filed complaints. Guess what? A woman in HR was fired and blamed it on her, saying she was unstable, etc. Karma. Story 27. Many years ago, I worked in a 5-star hotel. I was a banquet worker, so I was in charge of organizing and executing weddings, parties, and other events. As a rookie, I realized something fishy was going on when I was left alone to take apart a huge bar mitzvah and decorate it for the NBA. As you can imagine, the room was a mess. I was left alone until 5 a.m. to get everything sorted out and organized. But even then, I wasn't done. When the maintenance staff came in the morning, they started complaining. When my next shift came, I went to HR to complain. It turned out that I had been suspended for having a hostile attitude toward coworkers. A few days later, I was informed by phone that I was being terminated. If there was one good thing about COVID-19, it was the knowledge that the company probably lost a lot of money. I remember telling a woman I was dating about it, and she said, "That's terrible." Story 28. There was an anonymous questionnaire about the company, the department, and the manager. I hated the company and the department, but at that moment I needed a job. I really doubted that the questionnaire was really anonymous, so I gave an average answer, not too negative and not too positive. The department was full of cheerleaders who kept saying how this was the best company and what great managers they had. I felt like I was the only one who didn't like the department, so I figured a negative answer would make me stand out. In the end, an anonymous survey showed that our department was the lowest in the company in employee satisfaction, and our manager was the lowest of all managers in the company. All of these cheerleaders secretly hated the company as much as I did, but only expressed it when they thought they were anonymous. Instead of changing the management, after a few weeks they started firing employees one by one. I somehow managed to avoid being fired, and I am convinced it was because I was very careful and diplomatic. After a while I quit, and they were very surprised because they thought I was happy with the work culture and my job. It's very anonymous. Story 29. I've held leadership positions in some of the largest companies and was very disappointed to see that they are usually nothing more than wiping departments. Create a better culture. Attract the best people. Make it an interesting, challenging, and rewarding place to work, with development opportunities, support, coaching, and more. Recognize that the company is its people and create fertile ground for them to grow, be rewarded, and become the company's greatest evangelists. Because that would be really great. No, weirdo. We're here to make sure you don't sue the company and that we get enough data and influence to make you go quietly when we want you to quit. Idiots. They could have made it beautiful, but they didn't, and they are making it out of C***P, gravel, and corn. Thanks for listening. And thanks for the silverware, kind stranger. Story 30. In my case, I worked in HR and was scammed by HR because I hated my previous job and wanted to leave. B. I really liked what the company was doing, railroading my dream. And C. I was told I couldn't offer more than that, and I had already exceeded what they could offer. I was an IT person in HR, and one day, after about 7 months on the job, I was asked to bring a list of all the people who had left HR in the last year. There were only 3 people on that list, one of whom was my predecessor. When I pull information from the HR database, I automatically get a lot of information from HR. They were paying my predecessor, who was less qualified than me, $20,000 a year more than me. I also dreamed of working in the railroad industry, so I was commuting over 90 minutes to work every day. After a few weeks, I found a new job just 30 minutes from home. Edit. Also, my last new job paid me more. Story 31. I work in the biotech industry, and up until a few years ago, we were allowed to consume alcoholic beverages on our lunch hour unless we were dealing with something dangerous. A colleague of mine, chief scientist, basically a consultant/lab manager, and his coworker finished work at 1 p.m. because they were doing biologics and cells dictated their work hours. Before heading home, they went to a pub across the street and were spotted by HR staff drinking alcohol. On Monday, they were disciplined without first explaining what had happened. At the meeting, they were told they had been given a warning. Although they said they were done for the day, I assume it was a verbal warning as they are excellent workers. It was lifted a week later when the attendance information came out. Many of us would then go to the pub at lunchtime and drink rum cola to mess with HR. But one day one of our staff went to the boss with photographic evidence as we witnessed her drinking wine. It would have been horrible for management if we had all found out she was punished, but as far as we know, nothing happened. If she had been caught, I'm sure an internal email would have been sent out reminding her not to drink on her lunch break. Story 32. At the company I worked for, 3 men were fired on suspicion of sexual misconduct. One of them was out of the country at the time of the alleged incident, and the other 2 worked in different departments and didn't even know who the woman was. The company and he decided it would be less damaging in the long run to fire them and then investigate, and it turned out that she had been trying to find these men on Tinder but hadn't found a match, so she decided to redeem herself. One of them was immediately rehired, and the other 2 sued the company and nearly brought the company down. She was fired, and the company refused to give her a letter of recommendation. Unfortunately, all 3 were very important to the company, had been with the company for many years, and worked in completely different departments than the woman who sued. It took almost 2 years to sort through all the confusion and about half a day to investigate and determine that she acted with malice. The personnel manager was fired, along with other female employees who demonstrated that they held certain beliefs that would immediately deem any man a marauder, regardless of his true or false background. Story 33. 11 years ago, I slipped and fell on the mopped floor of the hotel where I worked. There was no sign of a wet floor. The hotel didn't have enough of them. I knew the floor was wet, but I was in a big hurry because I had a shift before midnight that day and had to get home to get a few hours sleep before taking a new shift at 6:30 a.m. the next day. He hit his tailbone in the fall and 11 years later still suffers from pain and cannot sit on hard surfaces for long. It may not seem like a big deal, but it changed my life. Anyway, at the time I had to take a couple days off work because the pain was so bad. When I went back to work, they called me in for an interview with HR, but in hindsight, it was for their own safety. They made me sign a waiver stating that it was not their fault. I was young and naive at the time and was afraid I would lose my job if I didn't sign the waiver, so I signed it. As a result, years later, when I realized that the injury had changed my life and was indeed their fault, I was unable to seek compensation. The moral of the story is this. Staff exists to protect the employer, and they don't care about you. Story 34. I was working as an engineer in a telecommunications company, and there was a course organized on new equipment that the engineers had to work on. This course was a 2-week training abroad in luxury hotels, etc. The HR department was very close to the sales department, and they were the ones selling the product, so they, not the engineers, decided to attend this course. The sales department came back from the luxury course a month later. The engineers had to work on equipment they had no idea how to use. Management became furious and fired the entire HR department. The company got along just fine without the HR department. Story 35. When I was laid off because I was depressed and started taking a new medication that was making me drowsy, and I talked openly about it. HR basically said, "We sympathize with your situation, but we're not flexible enough for you." I applied for 2 days off a year to stay home while I got used to my new medication, but it was a very bad time, and when I went back to work, my boss sent me a letter on my desk titled termination and asked me to come in 2 days later for a meeting with HR. I told them they could fire me for depression, but they could admit it and not say it was because of my excellent performance. This offensive language is just extraordinary. Story 36. It happened a few years ago, but my blood still boils when I think of it. Her husband's sister called and said she was 22 weeks pregnant and the baby died due to complications. The funeral was on Saturday. I called her at work since I had a shift on Saturday. I was working at a nursing home at the time. I briefly explained the situation and told her that paid bereavement leave was not needed, although I appreciated the pay, and that unpaid personal leave would suffice. The scheduling department told me that when a close relative or a nephew dies, 1 day of paid leave is available for the funeral. This was fine with me. A few days before the funeral, I received another call from my place of employment. After an internal discussion about the unique situation, management decided that the child was not fully formed and therefore did not count as paid bereavement leave. I was very stunned. I told everyone at work what had happened, and they were all upset and frustrated. My upset was passed on to management, who told me that the director would pay me compensation for my bereavement day, but warned me that such things should not be spread around the office. Needless to say, this is wrong. If they don't want me to know they are mistreating me, they shouldn't mistreat me. Story 37. After a restructuring from my previous job, I was assigned to work a level below me at a company. I had only been at that level for about 2 years, so it was kind of a let's see how you do before we assign you to this level kind of thing. It's okay. I can prove myself easily. I've done it many times in the past, and the company is growing fast. I've been working there for about 6 months at this point. I'm doing my best and keeping my nose to the wind. I come to work early, meet all deadlines, and am respected and liked by my coworkers. I rarely see my main boss, and when I do, he is aloof and not very friendly. And now, due to business expansion, a position has become available that I am eager to fill. Asked my main boss for a meeting to fill the position. In a very professional manner, I asked him about the promotion that was agreed upon when I was hired. He said that there was no such agreement and that he did not trust me. I was genuinely shocked that this man was lying through his teeth. Fortunately, the agreement was in writing when I joined the company and I reported it to HR. The only thing that was unclear was how many years after joining the company would be considered a promotion. I brought a copy of my contract to the meeting to discuss this issue. Basically, they said that I needed to gain trust first. I tried to explain that they were starting to lose confidence in my credibility and leadership. Their response was, "You have to trust us." No, you can never trust us. After that meeting, I started looking for another job, barely having time to do what needed to be done in my previous position. I found a job that paid more, which was what I was going for, and I didn't even give them 2 weeks notice of my termination. I just went to the hiring manager, put my name tag on the desk, and said I wasn't coming back. Someone who won't listen to me and accuses me of being a jerk, yet says I should trust him, doesn't deserve my trust or respect. Story 38. At the company where I worked, the HR manager was friends with the head of the accounting department, but no one knew about it. His supervisor wasn't in our office, so she hired him when a position became available. They hired this person because they trusted her. He was competent, but soon began sexually harassing most of the women who worked for him. There were many good-looking women in our accounting department, too. One woman went to HR with a complaint. She was told not to mention it again, or the HR manager would call her husband and threateningly tell him that his wife was having an affair. A few weeks later, the woman quit her job. The other woman went to complain, but nothing was done. HR didn't threaten her, but told her boss, who tried to make her job heck. A few weeks later, the CEO came to the office. All the women in the accounting department went to the CEO and told him what was going on. That same day, he fired the HR manager and the head of the accounting department. Then there was a big meeting of the whole company, and the CEO told us what had happened. After the meeting, several women from another department came to him and told him that they too had been harassed and were afraid to talk to HR about it. The great thing was that the woman from HR had been so disliked before that she filed a report with another company we worked with. One of my friends who used to work at my company also worked at this company. The owner came to him and asked about her as she was coming in for an interview that day. He told his boss not to hire her. He had problems with her before. He made sure to meet with her after the interview. Story 39. New senior management has arrived. There was one mandatory meeting for all employees. Usually there are several mandatory meetings so that all employees from all shifts and departments have the opportunity to attend. We were told to bring our cell phones to the meeting, which we did. Rumor has it that they can check your cell phone or something. When we arrived, there were instructions on the board on how to log in and take the survey. The topic of the survey? The beauty of working here. The survey was anonymous, and we were told to answer honestly, but we used our employee ID numbers to log in, and managers walked around behind the shoulders of those taking the survey. Not surprisingly, it wasn't long before there were posters everywhere bragging about the company being ranked third in the industry and the best companies to work for, or some other such nonsense. Rumor has it that senior management was rewarded with huge bonuses. We farmers in the field, on the other hand, were still suffering from lack of training, lack of manpower, bullying from middle management, and lack of supplies. Story 40. I worked as a manager for a large company in Texas. I became friends with a manager from another department. Dave had to fire an incompetent woman in his group. Along the way, she complained to HR that Dave was a racist and fired her for being Mexican American. She claimed that Dave hates people with Mexican blood. Dave had a Norwegian last name, a long name with few vowels. In addition, Dave was a man whose origins were impossible to guess. A tanned European? Arabian? Italian? Dave's father was 100% Scandinavian, but his mother was born in Mexico. Dave was half Mexican and was closer to his mother's family than his father's. Dave had to go through a month-long hearing with Human Resources on the grounds that he was racist toward Mexican Americans despite being Mexican American. On the grounds that he was racist towards Mexican Americans despite being Mexican American. Story 41. 2019, I traveled to Belgium over the weekend. I was supposed to go to work on Wednesday. I work as a chef, but unfortunately I got a fever on Monday evening and started limping. I managed to get back to Germany, went straight to the doctor, and got a sick leave for the rest of the week. Lying in bed, I decided to upload photos from my trip. The colleague who had tipped me off saw them and showed them to his superiors. This resonated with HR, and they asked me to turn myself in. I had previously communicated with them about the request for new uniforms, so I came in thinking that's what they meant. But they didn't. They didn't believe me when I told them the picture was taken over the weekend and condescendingly scolded me. I was in total shock, and my mind went blank. I insisted again and again that the pictures were taken over the weekend, but she just looked at me condescendingly and said something like, but it's illegal to go on vacation with a sick leave. She didn't listen to me at all. I left the meeting and cried in the bathroom for 15 minutes. I was also furious that a coworker, I don't know who it was, saw this message and informed me of it, rather than asking me about it first. It completely changed my attitude towards everyone, and I immediately deleted everyone from my social media. After calming down and talking to my parents, I was able to take a screenshot of the metadata of the photo. I sent it as an attachment to an email with surprisingly polite wording to prove my innocence. Nothing else happened, but it thoroughly shook my confidence in management and how I thought they would handle the issue. To be fair, my immediate supervisor, the chef, should have dealt with me directly, but I was later told that while he was aware of the situation, he didn't give it much thought and let it escalate. He's in as ***. Story 42. My company's rating on Indeed and Glassdoor was about 2.6 stars. We hired a consulting firm to help us raise our rating to 3 stars or higher, which resulted in HR asking some employees to leave reviews on the site and telling them to let the hiring manager know when they were done. I wasn't among those asked to leave a review, but wrote it anonymously anyway. A few months later, HR made everyone sign a legal document stating that no negative reviews would be left on the site while they were employed with the company and for 2 years after they were fired, even if they were fired. If they didn't want to sign this document, they were fired on the spot. The document said that once they were fired for a certain number of years, the company could not hire other employees. The document also said that they could not inform them of a vacancy or even contact them about the vacancy. Story 43. At Wally World, I was sick for 3 days and was given a doctor's note explaining the reason. I went to Human Resources and explained that at the time I had just joined the company's health insurance system and did not have a doctor. Without an attending physician, I could not fill out the leave form and asked for help. HR told me not to worry and to wait until the request was denied so it could be manually approved. I made sure to submit a doctor's note to HR, but unfortunately did not keep a copy for myself, and by being absent from work for 3 days, I exceeded my attendance points. However, the HR department waited 2.5 months before firing me. Because of this, I was unable to get a pay raise. I asked HR if there was a way to stop this and resolve the situation. I almost begged them to give me my job back, but they just told me to contact the manager who quit and was no longer with the company. HR told me that they never said they would help me with items or paperwork and that if there were any problems with my termination, they never gave me any information about them. All of this came to light when I applied for unemployment benefits. HR tried to deny the application and ended up having a 3-way conversation between me, the state unemployment office representative, and HR. After hearing my side of the story and HR's side of the story, the rep began to denounce HR's side of the story. The fact that it had been 2.5 months since I had been on leave due to the attendance policy, as well as a copy of my doctor's note that I had gone to the doctor a second time to get off work, turned HR against me. The state checked them out, and furthermore, Wally World was ordered to pay my unemployment expenses. I have a better paying job now, but this HR person was so duplicitous that I gave up.